Okay, we're going to move into the last section of the course, which will be American Literature since 1945. So this is going to be that next volume, Volume E, in your textbook, or if you have one that's all together, it'll be toward the end. So Volume E is what we're looking for here. So please make sure that when I give you page numbers to read, you realize we're in Volume E, Literature since 1945. Some people call this the contemporary or the postmodern period, and those terms are a bit fraught with difficulty to define, lack of definition for the most part. So I'm going to try to give you a clearer picture, maybe of some things that are going on in this time period, because there was so much and is so much, and then a couple of things that I really want to focus on as we think about the postmodern period in American literature. So after World War II, so we have World War II here, some of the most iconic photographs from World War II after the United States joined the Allied forces and defeated Hitler and fascism in Europe. So when people returned home from war, there was celebration, there was jubilation, the economy rebounded. People had a lot of money, or more money than they ever had before. There was more mobility. Things were just really, really looking up in American economics overall. Some of the things that mark this period, however, were dealing with the results of the Holocaust. And when Hitler's ethnic cleansing program of Jews, certain Christians, and people that supported Jewish causes and were fighting against genocide. So these photographs are the one on the left, and I know it's all very disturbing, but it's important to understand this time period. And of course, this was during World War II. So this is a mass grave in a Nazi concentration camp. You can see where this one, I think it's a woman, is still alive, and the guard is gunning her down to make sure that she is indeed dead, and then they're just going to fill in this hole and bury all these people. This was one of the ways that they exterminated Jews. The gas chambers were another, and then the furnaces, where they would burn the bodies in the different concentration camps. This is the state of those people. This is a group of men that survived, who knows how. Starvation, brutal experimentation, where they were treated as less than human. And so the fallout from the Holocaust was a worldwide issue. 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis. So it just became an ever-present struggle for Jewish people, and many of them sought refuge in the United States, as well as some other welcoming parts of Europe. Israel would not be founded as a state until 1948, so there were 3 years there where there was mass immigration to the U.S. And to other parts of Europe. The Korean War took place during this period of time. The U.S. forces were involved in basically a civil war between North Korea and South Korea. You know, we're still having problems with North Korea today. And so we were the supporters of the South Vietnamese against the North Koreans, who were being funded in large part by the Soviet Union and communist sympathizers. Then in the 60s into the 70s, we had Vietnam. This was a very controversial war during that mid part of the later part of the 20th century. Soldiers were asked to fight in horrible, horrible conditions without knowing who their enemy was most of the time. It was just a very divisive time in U.S. history, and I could give you an entire lecture on the Vietnam War, but I'm not. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides here. This is an example of a protest rally, just to show how widespread disdain for this conflict was. And we lost many, many men in the Vietnam War, and pretty much for no reason. So there was a lot of anti-government sentiment floating around at this time of the purposes for the war. This war actually spanned 3 different presidents, so it was a long, drawn-out ordeal with no real resolution of any sort. Then, of course, during this period of time, we have the Civil Rights Movement, and you see a march here with some major, very familiar civil rights leaders that you should recognize. Right up here. Shame on you if you don't. Look them up, see who they are. And then sadly, this is a photograph from Birmingham during the Bull Connor reign in the police department, so to speak, where it was this sort of situation, dogs being turned loose on African American protesters, as well as water hoses. I should have included a photo of that as well, but just a lot of unrest in our culture and in America in the 60s with Vietnam, with the Civil Rights Movement. And then you had the Cold War on top of that, where you had this fundamental battle going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this lasted into the 80s, into the late 80s when the Berlin Wall came down. So the whole world was basically becoming a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States on one hand advocating democracy, the Soviet Union on the other advocating communism. And so for a while, up until the end of the 80s, this was a very, very tense time. Lots of threats of nuclear destruction, and a lot of the treaties that were put in place, that are existing now, that are being debated, were put in place during this period of time to keep nuclear proliferation at bay. So lots and lots of things going on. And of course, we have the rise of the internet that has totally revolutionized American culture and actually world culture. So all of these things and many, many more have happened in the United States and in the world since 1945. So it's very, very difficult to say this is a theme, or this is something you look for in the literature, or it's very, very difficult to do that because the culture changed in such magnificent ways, and it's still changing today. However, I want us to try to drill down on a couple of things, hopefully that as we read through the last set of texts over the next few weeks of the class, you can kind of focus on in this literature. I want to include this quote here by Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, that you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. So I chose this quote because it really gets at the heart of what was going on in literature, I think, during this so-called contemporary or postmodern period. Like I said, there's really no unifying theme or characteristic, but what many writers were doing was showing the ways that certain social constructs, ways of thinking, ways of knowing, were being radically questioned. And here in this statement by Atticus, we're being invited to crawl inside other people's skin, inside other races, inside other genders, inside other religions, inside, I would even now, inside other people with different sexual orientations, people different from us on any kind of level, and trying to understand life from their perspective, trying to understand the issues that they face, the battles that they're confronted with, the social world that has defined them in certain particular ways. And I think that to a large degree that this postmodern literature, this literature after the modern period, after World War II, is encouraging us to do that. As our world has shrunk because of technology, and we are brought face to face or Snapchat to Snapchat with people vastly different from us from all over the place. You know, our world is opening up, and our ways of knowing and thinking about things are changing radically. And so this is one of the things that I really see going on in this contemporary or postmodern period. So I want you to think about two things specifically as we move through this. One is the concept or the idea of hegemony. And hegemony is basically politics. It is, but not politics in the sense of political parties like Republicans, Democrats, or Independents, but politics in the sense of power relationships, of one group exercising power or control over another group. Okay? In other words, what's happening in a lot of this literature that we're going to be looking at has to do with the politics of gender, race, and class. In other words, which gender is in the hegemonic space, which race, which class, which groups are exerting power relationships over other groups. So the selections that we will read will all in some way deal with identity and how it is socially and culturally constructed. Who is in power? What is at stake? Who is out of power, so to speak? And raising awareness of different perspectives, okay, whether those are of gender or race and or class, is imperative in these texts. And these writers see the value in giving the reader the opportunity to crawl around inside someone else's skin, to look at these power relationships, to focus on them, and to see things from a different perspective. The other is this concept that the personal is political. How this is playing out in these texts. In other words, how a character, for example, in a play or a story that we read, represents a larger group. Okay, so that character is not only that character in the story, but that character is a representative of a larger group that is in some way overdetermined by the culture in which that person lives. So based on that person's gender, based on that person's race, based on that person's class or sexual orientation, how has the culture constructed them? And where do they fit in sort of this power structure, okay, in the sense of who's got control? So we will pay attention to not only how characters are representing a person or an individual, but how those characters are representing a larger group and where that larger group fits in the overall culture. So pay attention to a couple of those things. I'll point those things out as we move through these texts, and hopefully we can get our minds around all this vastly different literature.